Well, good morning. Well, thank you all for being here. More on that in a minute here. I'm Carl Strock. Currently have the honor of being both the president of the Sons of the American Revolution Rappahannock chapter here in town, and also the president of the Essex County Museum. Both of these organizations are sponsors for today's event. So I want to thank you all for being here. First, a very important administrative announcement. There's a little cubby hole on the left over here as you came in, or on the right as you came in. That's the restroom, so feel free to use that. If we have to evacuate, I don't think that's going to happen at all, but if we have to, we'll all go out the door you came in, the door at the end. These exits are not available to us now. We'll begin with some formalities. What I'm going to ask you to do is open your books. And we'll sort of set the stage with a number of recitations here. The first one is I would ask you to rise and face the flag, and we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And please remain standing with your booklets. In the SAR, we have a number of ritual things we do, and I'd like for you to join us in those, even though you may not be a member of the organization. The first of these is the invocation. And Steve, if you will lead this, we'll follow you, but we'll read this together in unison. It's on the second page of your program. Almighty God, creator and protector of our nation, we ask your blessing upon this assembly as we honor the memory of our revolutionary ancestors. We thank you for the principles of liberty, freedom, and justice that they established through their service and ultimate sacrifices. Grant us the wisdom to maintain those blessings, the fortitude to defend our constitutional republic, and the grace to serve our communities with honor. Guide our discussions and fellowship today. Amen. And then we'll follow that with the SAR pledge again. Please join the members of the SAR with this. We, descendants of the heroes of the American Revolution, who by their sacrifices established the United States of America, reaffirm our faith in the principles of liberty and our constitutional republic, and solemnly pledge ourselves to defend them against every foe. Well, thank you very much, and please be seated. I want to begin by thanking a number of people who made this possible. First of all, I want to thank April Rounds, our county supervisor or administrator, for allowing us to use this wonderful facility. We have normally done this outside, rain, shine, thunder, lightning, brutal heat, but we're delighted that we could now use this beautifully renovated space. It's appropriate because this is the original courthouse of Essex County. And in this courthouse is where the meetings, some of the meetings we're talking about actually occurred. More on that later. But it's really wonderful to be able to gather here in this environment on this beautiful day. So thank you all for coming. I also want to thank Wright Andrews, who's been a mover in this whole thing. Wright has orchestrated, choreographed, researched, and put all of this together. So we thank Wright for all of his efforts on our behalf, not only today, but throughout the years in his various roles of leadership. And I want to also thank, in absentia, Michael Rawlings, who is our resident genealogist, who has brought a number of our readers together and ensured we have the appropriate people doing the appropriate readings this morning. So all that is a compliment of Michael, who could not be with us this morning. And finally, to you for being here on this lovely day when you could be doing other things, to honor and remember our patriot ancestors, many of whom are your ancestors, direct ancestors, but all of whom preceded us as county residents in this. And so it's important that we understand the context in which they worked and the sacrifices that they made. They all pledged their lives and fortunes in support of our country, whether in uniform or whether politically or financially or logistically. many citizens who are unnamed in this county participated in the activities we're celebrating today. I'd like to start with really a special event, I'll call it, a special reading by Ed Hale. Ed? As you know, Ed is an author and poet, and I've asked him to read his poem, Independence Day. Or recite it if you can, Ed.
I can't recite it, no. No, this was actually written for the bicentennial. Independence Day. Run, run. It's the 4th of July. Look at that rocket scatter the sky. Here comes the fight, boy. Here comes the drummer marching, the hottest day of the summer, because it's Independence Day, the day the land of freedom woke in 1776 from revolutionary smoke. The document of unredressed grievances and underlined with force and eloquence expressed, North and South, the country's mind. Quote of Benjamin Franklin. America's United States, there were 13, and all declared a new republic's birth, the greatest nation on the earth from Independence Hall. Listen, look, they pepper the sky. Firecrackers signify the democratic constellation. Bursting reels in celebration. The Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. 57 names were penned, and tyranny came to an end forever in Columbia. That government, by free consent of the electorate, now meant that preference and powers entrenched in clique and oligarch were benched. And all men so created equal had unalienable rights in sequel to life and liberty, no less than the pursuit of happiness. Spread the bunting, fly the flag, proud and patriotic, brag the loudest any people can, the universal rights of man. For here's the fife boy, here's the drummer, marching the hottest day of the summer. Thank you.
Well, Ed, thank you very much. What an appropriate way to kick off this very special 4th of July and commemoration of our Essex Resolves. We're going to do a number of things today. You know, traditionally, things like the Resolves, the Declaration of Independence, were actually read as opposed to being distributed for reading, because many of our citizens could not read. And so this is the way they communicated this. So we're going to return to that custom today and read both the Essex Resolves by many of the descendants of the actual people who signed those resolves. And we're also going to read the Declaration of Independence by some of our fellow citizens. So thank you all for participating in this program. You know, the causes of the revolution were varied and complex, and we're going to focus on how Essex County and Virginia played a role in that broader context. Your brochure, which Wright put together, has the details of various activities that led up to the revolution, beginning with the Stamp Act of 1765 and culminating with the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to kind of work through that history very quickly, read those documents. Tim Manley is going to share with us, who's the executive director of the museum, is going to share with us an interesting sidelight and follow up on the resolves. And following the declaration discussion, we're going to ask Dr. Steve Hunley to come up and talk about some of the following efforts that our patriot ancestors participated in, and the prices many of them paid for their devotion to our country. So let's begin in November of 1765 with the imposition of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was passed by the British to collect money by putting a stamp on every paper document that circulated, a bill of sale, a deed, a will, everything had to have a stamp on it. And those monies went to the Crown, partially to repay the Crown for the money they spent in the French and Indian War on our behalf in defending our local colonies. But as you know, the colonists chafed under that. Within months, a number of locals met in Leedstown, right across the river here, and on February 27th, they provided the Leedstown Resolves. And this was a sort of a spontaneous thing of about 400 freeholders that came together. And we won't go through the entire Leedstown, but very similar to the Essex Resolves. And the very next day, on February 28th, a group of about 400 men marched down to the foot of Prince Street to where we call the Essex House, which at the time was the Archibald Ritchie House. And Archibald Ritchie was a Scottish merchant who was abiding by the Stamp Act. And these 400 citizens said, "You shall not do that." So he backed off of that. And that then and went on to become a very active patriot in the cause. So that was our initial response. That response was the largest gathering in pre-revolutionary times of anybody to really protest, largest gathering in Virginia to protest the Stamp Act. It was repealed in 1766, a year later, but replaced by a thing called the Townshend Act. And the Townshend Act actually then levied duties on any import. So anything you bought, glass, china, whatever you bought and imported in this country had a tax imposed on it, which was actually stronger and stiffer and more widely applied than the Stamp Act. It also limited the authority of the various colonial legislatures. And it brought thousands of British troops into this country, mainly in Boston, to both reinforce the Stamp Act and to deal with the rising unrest in that city and that colony. Actually, during this period, Massachusetts was actually declared to be an open rebellion. And all the other colonies supported the Massachusetts colony in some way. The Townshend Act then was repealed in 1770, about 5 years later, but it left a tax on tea. And of course that infuriated a lot of our British citizens here. And in 1773 they passed the Tea Act that gave the East India Company a monopoly on the tea import in this country. And it undercut a lot of our colonial merchants. And they expressed their outrage, as we all know, in the Boston Tea Party. And the British response then was to impose harsher restrictions on the colonies. And that brings us to Virginia here, where support for Massachusetts ran high. When the House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity with Boston, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, dissolved the assembly. They reconvened in Williamsburg's Raleigh Tavern, and among other things, asked each county in the colony to hold freeholder meetings to formalize their positions regarding the British actions. And one of the first of these resulted in the Essex Resolutions of July 9th, 1774. So the period from 1765 up until 1775 was a series of actions and reactions from both sides that led to this welling up of unrest within all of the colonies. The descendants of those freeholders will now read portions of the resolutions. They will introduce themselves and who their patriot ancestor was, and we'll run through those. Again, this document is the full text of the document is in your booklet. So with that, we will begin with. No, you're next, right? Yeah. No, you come after the resolution. Oh, so I'm sorry. Yes. So, off script here. Tim Manley will get that portion done.
And this starts off our Essex forefathers. And I will say, I'm from South Carolina myself, so I always felt a little weird saying that. So I would usually change the words. But I just recently found out I'm a direct descendant of one of the signers of the Leedstown Resolves. So How about that? So, our Essex forefathers were known for their unyielding opposition to British policies that stripped away American liberties. Proudly, our community came forth with clear, sweeping, and forceful resolutions after former members of the House of Burgess, William Roane and James Edmondson, both from Essex, called an emergency meeting at this very courthouse in Tappahannock on Saturday, July 9th, 1774. Hundreds of men, from wealthy planters to small yeoman farmers, gathered on this courthouse green and unanimously adopted the text our local readers will now deliver.
I'm Bob Jump, and I'll be reading the Essex Resolves. At a meeting of the freeholders and other inhabitants of Essex County, Virginia, at the courthouse thereof on Saturday, the 9th of July, 1774, seriously to consider the present dangers which threaten ruin to American liberty. Mr. John Upshaw, being chosen moderator, the following resolves were proposed and unanimously agreed to. First, resolved that we will, at all times and on all occasions, bear true and faithful allegiance to His Majesty King George III, and as free men, we will always been and ever shall be willing constitutionally to give and grant liberally our property for the support of His crown and dignity and the preservation of our parent state. But that we can never consent to part with it on any other terms. Second, resolved that the legislature of this colony for the purpose of internal taxation is distinct from that of Britain, founded upon the principles of the British Constitution, and equal in all respects to the purposes of legislation and taxation within this colony. Thank you.
My name is Edward Hale, and my ancestor is David Pitts. Resolved that the people of this colony in particular, and of America in general, have a clear and absolutely right to dispose of their property by their own consent, expressed by themselves or by their representatives in assembly. And any attempt to tax or take their money from them in any other matter, in all other acts tending to enforce submission to them, is an exertion of power contrary to natural justice, subversive to the English Constitution, destructive of our charters, and oppressive. Fourth, resolve that the town of Boston, in our sister colony of Massachusetts Bay, is now suffering in the common cause of North America for the just opposition to such acts. And it is indispensably necessary that all the colonies should unite firmly in defense of our common rights. Fifth, that it is the opinion of this meeting that an agreement to stop all exports to and all imports from Great Britain and the West Indies, firmly entered into and religiously complied with, will at all times prove a safe and infallible means of securing us against the evils of any unconstitutional and tyrannical acts of Parliament, and may be adopted upon the principles of self-preservation, the great law of nature. Thank you.
I'm Bill Croxton, and John Croxton is who I'm associated with the Revolutionary area, and didn't know him And I don't know anything about him. And my son's a genealogist, so I'll have him do some research on that. I do have to, as a little ad lib, there's Croxton's at St. John's, and my grandson and his fiance, well, no, his wife, who was pregnant, were walking, and they saw Judge Croxton, their dog, jump the fence, and it's right to the left of the walkway, and dog landed on this tomb, and so they went over and read, and she was pregnant at the time, and Judge Croxton's daughter, I think it was Virginia Scott, may have been his wife. Anyway, they named this grandchild Virginia Scott, and we call her Scotty. So, and there are other Scotts in the family, so that. 6, resolved that the inhabitants of this county will firmly join with the other counties of this colony and the other colonies on this continent, or a majority of them, to stop all exports and imports from Great Britain and the West Indies and all other ports of the world, except the colonies of North America. If such a measure shall be deemed expedient by the deputies at the General Congress, and whatever agreement the Congress shall come to for the advancing of common cause of North America relating to exports, imports, or otherwise, ought to be considered as binding as any other act of legislation, and that we will use our utmost endeavor to support and maintain such general agreement at the expense of our lives or our fortunes. 7, resolve that it is the opinion of this meeting that the civil courts in this colony ought not to proceed to the forwarding of trial of civil causes until our exports are open. Thank you.
I'm George Booker Jennings. My ancestral patriots from Essex County, excuse me, were James Booker and Lewis Booker. James was one of the Sons of Liberty, and Lewis was a captain of the artillery in the Continental Army. They settled the land west of here called Laurel Grove, which is now Wind Vineyards, so still active. 8th, resolve that it is the opinion of this meeting that the East India Company, having a desire to monopolize a great part of the American trade to the injury of other merchants of the Britain trading to North America, and knowing well the fatal consequences that must have resulted from their fixing a precedent for future taxes by importing tea into the colonies, became the willing instrument of the ministry to destroy American liberty and deserve the loss that they have sustained. 9th, resolved that we do most heartily concur with our late representatives in their resolve for the disuse of tea, and that we will not hereafter purchase any East India commodities whatsoever. 10th, resolved that the spirited conduct of the town of Boston hath been serviceable to the cause of freedom, all other methods having failed, and that no reparation sought to be made to the East India Company or other assistance for any injury they have sustained, unless it be express condition on which all our grievances shall be removed.
My name is Hannah Overton Tiffany, and I am a descendant of Captain Thomas Waring, who was commissioned as an ensign in November of 1776 by John Hancock. And I am also a descendant of Colonel John Hoskins of Mount Pleasant, King and Queen County, who was there at the surrender of Yorktown. 11th, resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that any general censure of the conduct of the town of Boston respecting the tea, without allowing them the motives of resistance upon which the principles of public virtue and necessity, is inimical to American liberty, and we are persuaded that none but ministerial hirelings and professed enemies of American freedom will adopt a language so impolitic which manifestly tends to create a disunion of sentiment at this time fatal to America. 12th, resolved that the Parliament have no right to pass an act to remove our persons to Great Britain or any other place whatsoever to be tried for any offense, and that we are determined not to submit thereto. 13th, resolved that it is the opinion of this meeting that no merchant in this or any other colony of this continent shall advance the goods now on hand higher than they are at the present or have been for some time, and that the merchants in the several counties sign an agreement to that effect.
Good morning. My name is Stephanie Stiles. I'm a direct descendant through my mother's line of Meriwether Smith, and I welcome all of you friends, neighbors, patriots, and history enthusiasts. Resolved, this is the 14th, that a subscription be set on foot for raising provisions for the poor of Boston, who now suffer by the blockading up of their ports, and that Robert Beverly, John Lee, and Musco Garnett in St. Anne's Parish, and Archibald Ritchie and John Upshaw in the upper part of South Farnham Parish, and Meriwether Smith, my ancestor, and James Edmondson in the lower part thereof take in subscriptions for that purpose, who are to consign what may be raised to some proper person to be distributed, and that before mentioned gentlemen are empowered to charter a vessel and send it to Boston.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Gill. I'm a late add-on to the agenda here, but the Gills settled in Northumberland and Lancaster County. Somehow I found my way to Essex. But I'm going to start with the 15th, resolve that this meeting have the deepest sense of the injuries in which the merchants and manufacturers of Great Britain must necessarily be involved by non-importation resolution. They have in place an almost unlimited confidence in us for a series of years, and by that means have the greatest part of their fortunes lodged in our hands, and that nothing but the desire of preserving our liberties could induce us to adopt a measure big with such melancholy consequences. 16th, resolved that James Edmondson and William Roane, Esquires, the late representatives of this county, be as they are hereby appointed deputies to represent us in the general meeting of deputies for the several counties of this colony on the first day of August in Williamsburg. And we desire that they will exert their best abilities for the security of our constitutional rights and liberties, and to appoint deputies to meet at the General Congress, the deputies of the other colonies on this continent. 17th, resolved that the clerk transmit the foregoing proceedings to the printers to be published in their Gazette. William Young, clerk of the meeting.
So the emergency committee that was established by the 14th resolve was remarkably successful, collecting and shipping over 1,000 bushels of corn to relieve the blockaded citizens of Boston. However, when shipping the grain, Essex leaders Robert Beverly, John Lee, John Upshaw, and Archibald Ritchie dispatched a warm letter of solidarity to John Hancock. The voyage, however, met unexpected drama. The cargo ship was blown completely off course by a severe Atlantic storm, ending up in the Leeward Islands near Puerto Rico. Fortunately, which that's way off course. Fortunately, a sympathetic merchant there bought the corn at full value and securely forwarded the money to Massachusetts. The funds arrived safely in March of 1775, just weeks before the outbreak of war. In acknowledgement, Essex leaders received an elegant letter of gratitude dated March 14, 1775, written on behalf of the city of Boston by none other than Samuel Adams, one of our most famous patriots. I encourage you to read this historic correspondence, which is preserved in full within your printed program. And really do read it. It's a wonderful letter. So take the time to take a look at it. Carl?
Thanks, Jim. So what follows was a series of actions that are outlined in your program that culminated with the mobilization of the Essex Militia in May 1775, 1 month after the battles of Lexington and Concord. In your program booklet, you'll see on about page 4 the short descriptions of the service of some influential people in the military side of the effort, some of which have already been mentioned by our readers. And we also have a listing of those who served in uniform in the Revolutionary Army, both the militia and the Continental Army. We'll continue to research that and build on that list. But you'll see the names of many people in this room and many families in this county that continue to reside here. The following that, the militia was activated in May. I mentioned that already. So with that, the Continental Congress then went to work in how we're going to structure this, and it resulted in the Declaration of Independence. So today we're going to have another series of readers read the elements of the Declaration, and we will begin with Gina McGuire.
Good morning. I am Gina McGuire, and I am a direct descendant of Mr. Lewis McGuire, who was the first black policeman in the town of Tappahannock. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness.
And I should have mentioned, Gina is also the first vice president of our Museum and Historical Society. Patty?
Good morning. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute deposition, that in their right it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferances of these colonies, and such is now the necessity to which constrains them to alter their former system of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
Hi, my name is Vicki Follett. He has refused his assent to the laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the rights of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and forbiddable to tyrants only. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Erin Kelly. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. The state, remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within.
He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries.
Good morning. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, given his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses.
Good morning. I'm William Lewis, and I'm descended from a number of the persons who are on the list, but probably most specifically from William Latney. And to continue with the reading, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. For taking away our charters, abolishing our valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, dissolution, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation.
Good morning, I'm Bill Ewell. I'm borrowing from the Tappahannock vernacular. I'm a come here, but I'm descended from some 25 revolutionary patriots. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Victor Burrell. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do, and for the support of the Declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Thank you.
Our rebellion came at a tremendous cost. We've already mentioned the role soldiers played in the revolution, but we also must recognize that many people contributed politically, economically, and just in general support, and pledged their own lives and fortunes, just as those signers of the Declaration of Independence did. So many people, both in and out of uniform, contributed. But there was a raw cost of independence. I want to ask Dr. Steve Hunley to step forward and share some of his views on that. Thank you, Steve.
Good morning, friends. I come with three comments. First, one is memory of George Brown Oliver, who was my history professor at Randolph-Macon College. He made me struggle, and boy, did I struggle. So, George, God bless you. I also come as a descendant of Robert Tillman. Robert Tillman was from Prince George County and settled in Fluvanna, and traced my registry through him. And I am not a part of any of these groups, but I'm certainly humbled to be able to come and share with you today. One of the things that is so tragic about war is that so often when we look back, we think of the triumph of war. We think of the opportunity to conquer and the opportunity to be in control. And we think of it often in a glorious way, that indeed we have honored many who have been in war, as we should, but we forget the actual, should we say, the actual earthiness and the earnestness of war. So today I share with you the struggle that happened in a particular way. This was a struggle in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The tragedy partly was because the Congress, Continental Congress, wanted soldiers to be available and close to Philadelphia to protect Philadelphia. If you use your Google Maps today, you will see that it is 23.4 miles to drive from Valley Forge to Philadelphia. I don't think that was that close in those days. However, it is a part of their decision in the process of warring that the Continental Congress wanted to have these soldiers nearby. However, there was a serious failure that happened in the midst of the struggle at Valley Forge. The struggle came because of how many soldiers and how many soldiers who were left. One of the things that is often said that I learned early in my life was that war never determines who's right, only who's left. In the struggle at Valley Forge, there was such a struggle because of the many soldiers who were there. The Continental Congress had provided that they wanted them there, but they didn't provide them in a way the structures of war to try to feed them, to try to clothe them, and to have them be able to accomplish the task before them. It is said that many of them were those who had no blankets, and they slept by campfires just to keep warm enough to survive. They did not have, many of them, did not have many shoes, or they didn't have clothes to take care of the body as well as the soul. In the great struggle at Valley Forge, many were lost, many died. There was sickness, there was illness among the soldiers. There was sort of what they called a reality of nakedness. the men lacked the basic features of human survival. On December 23rd, 1777, General George Washington wrote a desperate letter to the Continental Congress warning them that his army was on the brink of dissolution. And he says this: "We have this day no less than 2,898 men now in camp unfit for duty, because they are barefoot and otherwise naked. Numbers are obliged to sit up all night by fires, having no blankets to cover them. I am now convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse. In order to obtain subsistence is the best manner they can. Rest assured, sir, this is not an exaggerated picture, and that I have abundant reason to support what I say." Alexander Hamilton, who was there as an administrative person, bitterly observed the root cause of the crisis. He fiercely targeted the systemic failures of governance, observing in substance that the Army's distress arose not from a true scarcity of resources, but from a structural paralysis in public management and financial policy, a burden that fell entirely upon the bare backs of the troops. So there was an institutional collapse, an organizational one. There was a failure to be sure that the right substance, the food, the clothes, and whatever was necessary to take care of soldiers was a terrible struggle and a failure on their part. Money meant very little. At one point, the paper money that was printed by the Continental Congress was printed so that there was millions of dollars in Continental money, and sorry, it meant nothing. It was the time of war, and in this struggle, they had logistical failures, and over there was a terrible struggle at Valley Forge. We wanted to be sure that we remembered today that in the process of the revolution, in the process of forming a nation, yes, many lost their lives. Yes, many lost their lives in service of what was a true cause. We now have soldiers who fight for our country. They serve for our country. But this was a new country, and it was as much cause and trying to do everything that was right as it was anything else. Lest we forget the terrible sort of struggles of war like Valley Forge, we might go into war much too easily. Indeed, may we remember today the brave soldiers and the brave ones who came before us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Well, it's my great honor now to introduce a very special guest we have with us today. We'll conclude our spoken program with a presentation by one of Essex County's greatest historical figures, Colonel Meriwether Smith. And one of his descendants we mentioned is here with us today, direct descendants. Colonel Smith commanded the local militia, served as a prominent delegate in the Virginia Revolutionary Conventions, and represented our Commonwealth in the Continental Congress. Colonel Smith is portrayed by Wright Andrews, who also has deep roots here in the county. He's a local historian, and he's past president of the Essex County Museum and Historical Society. He's also past president of our Rotary Club. So Colonel Smith will step now forward to highlight his public service and to highlight the immense challenges our soldiers faced and the institutional supply failures Steve has talked about, to illuminate a harrowing chapter known to few today, and that's the brutal confinement of Essex soldiers aboard British prison ships in the Charleston Harbor. Please welcome Colonel Meriwether Smith.
you all. It's really for me a genuine joy to be in this building. It has so much Essex history in it. It is in this very building, at a bench right along there, that I served as a justice on the Essex Court. I handled hundreds of cases, and I learned a lot. I have to admit to you, though, that this 250th celebration makes me feel kind of weird and old. But that said, it's a wonderful thing. Now, I just want to mention that in addition to this building, I have some other history in this historic downtown of Tappahannock, Virginia. Several blocks away, a block and a half probably. You know that big white house over there now? They call it the Essex Inn. Well, I used to own the lot that it's sitting on. Had a nice little office there. And you know, across the street from that, you've got what we call Emerson's Tavern. It's now 1710 Tavern. I hear that the people who are running it now, wonderful people, they got better food than probably they ever had in Tappahannock. Good drinks and everything. Also hear that food and drinks are a whole lot more expensive than we had in our times. That said, though, there is a lot of revolutionary stuff, shall we call it, buildings, homes, etc., from revolutionary days. And that makes Tappahannock a little more unique than most of America, but I think it's something to be good. Let me tell you a little bit about me, since very few of you, unfortunately, don't know anything about Meriwether Smith. Well, I grew up in one of the most wealthy, very respected families in Essex County at that time. My father was the first clerk of the Essex Circuit Court. He went on to be the delegate from Essex County for years in the House of Burgesses. So, you know, I got a little homeschooling at night a lot of times about politics and government. Made me have interest in it. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I want you to know that my experiences in Essex and my experiences in particular too at our plantations, I ran, when I got old enough, I ran our various plantations, and we had more than one. I ran our international grain and seed operations where we shipped that all over the Caribbean, the world. I learned from that experience what very few people in the Congress, or indeed in the House of Delegates here in Virginia, they didn't know much about trade. It was a different world back then. But I learned a lot. And that was particularly valuable to me from that experience at Continental Congress, because the people up there, as the gentleman that spoke a few minutes ago, it's unbelievable. I had no idea myself when I was elected by the state delegates to join that wonderful body that we've heard so much about, the Continental Congress. Well, I'll tell you, it was really messed up. And One of these days, if I ever have time, I'll come back and tell you about that in detail, because it's not what I was taught in my history books. I mentioned that I served as a justice here. I learned an awful lot about law, human nature, in the pursuit of a fair result for everyone. That was an invaluable part of my education that I got in Essex County and I used in our state organizations and in the Continental Congress. Now, I want to say a bit about my personality. I'm kind of scared to do that, but I guess you ought to know. I'm being really direct with you, but that's the way I was with everybody. I recognized early on here in Essex County that I was brighter, a harder worker, etc., than a lot of folks were. I was sharper analytically, stronger when writing and speaking, and better prepared on the substance. I worked harder than almost any of my colleagues in the various places that I worked on behalf of the people. I'm not saying that to be arrogant. It's just an honesty. Now, for some people, I'm not the easiest to work with. I didn't flatter folks, did I do, as y'all say, suck up to them? I didn't do that. And I didn't defer to men simply because they had big family names, powerful friends. I said what I believed. I pushed hard for what I thought was right. And I didn't much care if they didn't like me. And I'll tell you sometimes about some folks that you may have heard names of that didn't like me. And I'll tell you why they didn't, but not today. We don't have time for that. I did, though, have a very long public service record. I was in 4 of Virginia's 5 revolutionary conventions. Now, I doubt most of you know what is that. Well, when, as you heard earlier today, Governor Dunbar shut down, dissolved the House of Burgesses. At that point, they didn't have any government. So the former Burgesses usually got together immediately from all over the now Commonwealth, shall we say. And that began the de facto legislative body for Virginia. They did different things at each of those conventions. The biggest and most important, I'm going to talk a little bit about in a minute. But in my service, I did 4 of the 5 conventions. I was in the House of Delegates here many times. I was on the elite Governor's Council of State. Now, it was really cool, but again, I don't have time today to tell you all the stuff that went on there. I was in the 2nd Continental Congress. I am going to focus on that. I was at Virginia's Federal Constitutional Convention, where people voted for or against the Constitution. And I was on the very elite committee that worked many days before the convention actually passed on the document that was put before them, we had a whole lot of flaws in the original document. Our little group from all sides worked behind the scenes, came up with a long list of amendments that were set on when it got to Congress. And a lot of those were added, which was a good thing for America. Again, I'd say it's fair to say that I had more legislative experience than almost anybody in those days. A few others probably exceeded me, but I certainly was active in a whole lot of fronts. Now, I'm going to switch and talk about several things that are dear and dear to my heart. One, you've heard about the Essex resolutions. I hope everyone listened to those words and to the words in the Declaration of Independence. Words, ladies and gentlemen, are important. They are important today. They're important hundreds of years later. And they are important for letting us understand what our nation has been built on. Now, I can say that the Essex resolutions were just about the strongest. I'm trying to think who was even close, because I read every other one that was out there. But ours was tough. We didn't have 400 men come out here on the green and say, okay, let's write this down, okay, when they did those resolutions. You had some of the county's top leaders, and I would say it's reasonable to say that our former delegates who were no longer delegates were involved in that. I'd say somebody else was, me. But we came up with something that this generation and all generations can be proud of. We really did a good job on that. Now, switching over to the Virginia 5th Convention, which was from May to July of 1776. A resolution was urgently needed to have the Virginia State Legislature, which at that point was the convention, send the word up to Congress to come up and get it passed, a resolution for independence. So the chairman of the convention came up with the draft. Patrick Henry, you all have heard of that guy? Okay. He came up with the draft. I came up with the draft. Well, we didn't want to fight. We were good friends. So we sat down. I can't remember if it was in a tavern, but probably was. And we agreed on amending it and pulling it together. We took something from each of the drafts that we had, and we came up with a whole that was better. And I didn't want to offer that. Even Patrick Henry didn't think that that was the smartest way for him to do it. But you got the chairman of the convention there, and so we said, you do it, Mr. Chairman. He did. Guess what? It was unanimous saying that Virginia wanted to declare independence. That was huge. Every other colony looked to Virginia because we were the biggest, the strongest, the richest, and they had our ancestors in there, by the way. When we got through that, sent it up to the Continental Congress. Richard Henry Lee from across the river, many of you have heard of. He's famous for a number of things. As a senior guy, he took what we drafted and said, okay, he drafted his version of it, but he did exactly what we said do. Took it to the floor, sat there a few days, and then on June the 7th, 1776, it was brought up and passed. It wasn't unanimous, but it passed. That's very, very important. And I would just urge you, while everybody or many people know of Richard Henry Lee's offering that resolution, just keep in mind that folks back here in the then legislature, and I being one of them, wrote out what they needed to do. And he was a good guy and did what he was told to do. So just remember that people from Essex County, me, was involved in that. I was representing your ancestors, and we did a good job. Now, I will say one little word about my time in the Continental Congress. When I got to the Continental Congress in 78, at that point, Henry Lawrence of South Carolina, who I'm sure this gentleman here from South Carolina knows well of, he was the chairman then. And I hadn't been there very long before he came up to me. I hadn't even met him at that point. But he said, Mr. Smith, would you like to join 4 other folks, three other folks at that point, and me, he said, on a special committee that I'm putting together to try to deal with the horrible situation that General Washington and his soldiers were in. Now, you know, a little country boy coming in like that, you might think, well, whoa, should I do this? And it took me about 3 seconds to say, yes, sir, I would really like to be on that committee. Well, it was a wonderful experience, and I think I helped some. We met repeatedly over a number of days with General Washington. We tried to look at the Army as a complete trail, so to speak, and every aspect that he told us was wrong, and we tried to understand what was wrong. We took a lot of notes. We knew that there were the supply failures, little food, inadequate clothing, shoes, lack of medical treatment, etc. The Army was not getting what it should have to be representing the nation. But anyway, we worked and we worked. And then we went back to Congress. And our committee did a lot of good work. It wasn't easy. It wasn't, you couldn't just walk in and say, all right, gentlemen, here's a list of all these things that are wrong, and it shows that collectively you're pretty dumb on a lot of things. But we've got ways to help. So over a period of time, we got some major changes in how the Army was operating, how the food was getting to it, how clothes were getting to it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, how the soldiers were getting paid. that was a critical thing. I'm very proud to have been in that. And I'll say in my time, and again, this is not being bragging, it's just telling the truth, you know. I did an awful lot of work as a workhorse. And I hope y'all out in the country know what a workhorse is. I worked all the time. And sometimes I wonder how I did it without touting it a little more. But in any case, I think I did a lot of good things for us. Now, I'm going to end by following up the discussion on the terrible plight of the soldiers at Valley Forge. And I do talk about this as a soldier again. I was a colonel of the Essex militia, and most times I was having to be in the legislature one place or another. But hundreds of soldiers from Essex and thousands of patriots in the Continental Line found that when they had to surrender in the biggest surrender of the Revolution, May 12th, 1780, the people who were just local militiamen, they were allowed to go home. Just say you're not going to battle with us again, go on home. You don't know how to fight anyway, you're just a hillbilly, so to speak. And the others, though, who trained regular common line members, and we had a lot of those, they were marched right on to prison ships in Charleston Harbor. Now, these folks were really sent to floating engines of death. Men were crowded so closely, they could scarcely breathe. They were down in these old, they were just the hulls, really, of ships that had been stretched out. You know, they didn't have any flush toilets. They didn't have any toilets at all. They had an old bucket. Everybody on the floor got to use that, and it might get cleaned out, you know, once a month. But it was nasty, nasty down there. People were groaning and dying every minute of the day and night. In summertime, it was an absolute furnace to be on those ships. And on winter, you didn't have any way to really get warm either. Mortality levels were shocking. Men were dying by the dozens each day. Their bodies were dragged up from the hold. A couple of the British would go it overboard. They didn't get any monument. They just got tossed in the river. That was a bad experience. Many sons of Essex County who died in those ships, they don't have a grave here, since we don't know by any means everybody that served during that time, so you're not likely to find any names of theirs. But their bodies, their graves, just overboard. Shifting sands of the Carolina coast. And where did their remains go? Well, pretty much in the stomachs of fish and crabs. another experience of how cruel war can be. Didn't happen to everybody, but I'll tell you another thing. Of the folks that eventually got out of the ships, most of them are in really, really sad shape. And, you know, because it was a living hell. No other way to put it. So I talk about this as we celebrate the Constitution and our situation today, which is great. Let us never forget these men, the ones at Valley Forge, the ones on those prison ships, and a lot of other similar things that none of us know about. But they had a rough time. And I would say that God bless these men forever. Bless their souls. And I end by saying, may God always bless America. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Meriwether and Wright. I'll conclude today's session where I started, by thanking each of you for being here to remember, commemorate, celebrate the role that Essex County played in the road to the revolution and the actual winning of that great victory. Both Steve and Wright have given us reminders of the realities of war and the suffering that it actually took to accomplish our independence. And Wright put on a human face. We talked about events and places and times, but we had, through his portrayal of Meriwether Smith, the views of someone who was actually there in the room. I think it's interesting to note, as he described his personality, that he was very confident in his abilities relative to others, but the fact that he's a largely unknown patriot that had such an influence also reflects the fact that he was not in it for the glory or for the adulation. He was in it to get the work done. And I think that's a great testament to Meriwether and people like him. So again, thank you very much for being here today. What I'd like to do now is ask you to join me in the SAR recessional. And that is in the cover of your booklet here. And please recite that with me. Until we meet again, let us remember our obligations to our forefathers who gave us our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, an independent Supreme Court, and a nation of free men and women. With that, I will just leave you with the benediction. May the blessing of Almighty God rest upon us and all our endeavors. May He protect our nation's armed forces, preserve our hard-won liberties, and keep us steadfast in our devotion to the principles of freedom. Go forth in peace, and may His grace remain with you now and forevermore. Amen. Again, thank you all for being here today. And thank you to our speakers. Thanks so much.
If you want to learn more, go to the museum. We have our limited run special exhibition going right now, Give Me Liberty. It's only here through August 1st, and we're open today till 3, so stop by and check it out.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Tim. Thank you.